Good morning. This is a somewhat autobiographical address. I worked for many years in various aspects of human resources, that is, the people in organizations whose particular responsibility is for other people, for employees. And mostly it was a wonderful job. It had its ups and it had its downs. And at times it seemed very much like ministry, especially when one was counseling or encouraging somebody. But not always. At other times it felt quite tough, quite removed from ministry, such as when carrying out disciplinary activities or managing job losses. Over time, though, I realized that I had to think about the question of how do I reconcile that role of human resources with being a Christian. I've never yet been asked by somebody, how can you, a Christian, do some of these things? But I had started to ask myself. And in asking and pondering, I gradually arrived at two principles. Principles which I'm going to talk through during this reflection because I have found them to be helpful and they may perhaps be broadly applicable. And the first principle is the big one, that we are all accountable. We are all accountable. We all can be and will be called to give an account of our actions, to account for, to explain what we have done and what we have not done. To whom are we accountable? We're accountable to others, we're accountable to God, and we're accountable to ourselves. We're accountable to others, particularly those with whom we have an especially close relationship. I think in a relationship, the parties develop a degree of dependency on each other. A dependency sometimes for good and sometimes for ill. And we do this quite naturally. Merely by interacting with people, we create something of a relationship, albeit perhaps fleeting. We influence other people in many small ways. So we're accountable to others. We are accountable to God. I think you would expect me to say this, and it is really a fairly standard item of Orthodox Christian belief. We will, on Judgment Day, be called to account for the things that we have done in the body, and we are also held accountable minute by minute in love by God. And we're accountable to ourselves. We are created in the image of God, however besmirched that image may be. We are sentient beings. We think, we do things. Now, of course, there are things that influence us. Our mood can change hour by hour. Our temperament is usually more stable, although it varies. Our life situation at the time, for example, are we tired? Are we hungry? Are we excited? Our life history and our upbringing, our genes, all of these can influence us. But despite these influences, I'm convinced that we all retain the dignity, that our actions are counted as being of substance. What we do matters. And we also have the dignity that those actions are largely caused by us. We are not merely at the disposal of bigger forces. What we do matters. We cause things to happen. It's not a good example, I'm sure, but I used to give money to the sellers of Big Issue. And I'd say to them, keep the magazine, take the money. And in my thinking, they could sell it to someone else. And then a friend pointed out that I was taking from them the dignity of work, that they were working. They were earning that money, not just giving it as charity, receiving it as charity. I was taking that away from them, and also I was counting their work as being of no worth. We are meaningful beings. What we do has an impact. That is the first principle. We're accountable. And it can seem rather forbidding and condemnatory, I'm sure, in a disciplinary or something. If you're faced with somebody with that attitude, it can seem quite forbidding. If at work someone has contravened what is acceptable, or someone's not performing as they contractually should do, it can seem to be quite a tough and uncompromising position to take, because I would expect them to be held accountable and to hold themselves accountable for the good and for the bad. I also do expect the employer, if they have failed in some way, also to hold themselves accountable. But it is at this point that it all seems to be rather legalistic and forbidding that the second principle takes effect. And the second principle is this: we all have the capacity to change. to learn and to grow. Once accountability has been accepted, change can begin. If failing is accepted, remedial work can start. I have found that the acceptance of accountability has to come before learning and growing. Why bother to learn and grow if it's got nothing to do with you? Why bother to learn and grow if what you do has no impact on what happens? Do you see why it is so vital that we perceive ourselves to be meaningful actors who can have an influence on things? In my work in human resources as a Christian, I recall maybe 2 occasions, maybe more, where the person could not accept that they were accountable. In one, it was that the individual refused to accept that anything in the current situation could be held to their account. It was all someone else's fault, and there was nowhere to go. There could be no learning and growing. In another case that still makes me sad, the person accepted accountability almost enthusiastically, but they could not learn and grow. And I still wonder, maybe deep down they did not accept accountability. Well, those are my 2 principles. I'm sure they leave out a lot. I'm sure they leave out certain people. I'm sure they sound rather smug and self-satisfied. They're not intended to, because as I have grown older, I've increasingly often and increasingly rigorously applied them first of all to me. And it sometimes is uncomfortable. And I will admit this reflection is almost intended to be a self-indulgent sharing. If it's of any practical help to anyone, or stimulates any discussion, or stimulates any pushback, I would be delighted. And if it helped anyone to accept their accountability before God and to learn and grow and change, in gospel terms, if it helped anyone to repent and believe, I would be in the 7th heaven.